Hi there, this is Vincent Cassie coming to you from the Autocrat podcast, where we relaxingly talk through mythology, the Roman world, eventually when we get to it, not at the time of this little promo, and just really have fun and enjoy each other's company, laugh, create fun stuff, fun drawings, make insane suggestions about people that we talk about, so yeah. Come join us and listen to us wherever you want.
Yes, a journey through Greco-Roman civilization from myths like the Titanomachy to 1453 and beyond. And as my co-host said, if you want to find out who we believe to be a frog in Greek mythology or which king might be a tortoise, well, come and join us over on Autocrats. You can find us wherever you find your podcast or at our website www.autocratpodcast.wordpress.com. We hope to see you there.
Hello, and welcome to Grand Dukes of the West. Episode 56, Truce or Dare. Despite the fact that we've been more or less ignoring the 100 Years' War for the past several episodes, and the fact that it's been a while since the war was on Philip the Good's radar, the 100 Years' War was still going on. But now we are barreling headfirst towards the end of the war, so I think it's worth tracing the evolution of the conflict over the past decade and seeing how its later stages play out. As we know, Burgundian participation in the war in the 1440s was basically non-existent. After signing the Treaty of Arras in 1435, the Duke of Burgundy's total contribution to the French war effort was more or less indirect support for the retaking of Paris, a failed campaign against Calais, and a half-hearted campaign against Le Cretois. After those less than stellar results, a brief English invasion of Flanders, and some economic warfare, relations between Burgundy and England warmed back up, and peace between the two was re-established with the Intercursus of 1439. But the war continued to go on even after Burgundy washed its hands of it. This period of the 100 Years' War between the Treaty of Arras and the Truce of Tours was marked with steady French advance and English setback. Now, it's certainly not the most exciting period of the war. Heck, the Wikipedia page for the 100 Years' War simply skips over the years between 1435 and 1449. Still, though, this period was full of important developments, even if no great battles were fought. The English advance, which had seemed so irresistible throughout the 1420s, had stalled before the walls of Orléans and was then reversed by Joan of Arc. This would not lead to the imminent collapse of the English war effort, but it certainly put an end to any prospect of an outright English victory. And the years between Joan's arrival on the scene and the Treaty of Arras saw the tide continue to turn in favor of the French. With the signing of the Treaty of Arras and the loss of the Burgundian alliance, English fortunes fell still further. Philip had not really contributed much to the English war effort since the early 1420s, but his political support was a vital pillar of the English regime. In addition to the vast Burgundian lands, the Duke's allies and clients dominated northeast France, and when he jumped ship, many of those allies and clients followed him. In the aftermath of Arras, the English positions in Picardy, Champagne, and the Ile-de-France, already weakened, now collapsed. And now that Charles VII had one less front to deal with, he could focus his resources more on Normandy and the Pays de Conquête, the conquered lands surrounding the duchy, which seemed to shrink by the day. Moreover, now that the fighting was primarily taking place on English-controlled territory, the French king's finances could begin to recover while the Anglo-Norman tax base faced the brunt of things. French tax revenue began to rise significantly in the years after Arras, and the estates of Languedoc and Languedoc dutifully and regularly voted taxes to their king to carry on the fight. As time went on and the royal administration became stronger and more confident, this taxation began to be imposed by royal will, and the estates were sidelined. At the same time, England was growing increasingly exhausted with the burden of paying for the war, and the English crown was teetering on the edge of a financial disaster. English Normandy and the increasingly encroached upon Pied de Conquête could no longer pay for their own defenses, and the government in Rouen was growing ever more reliant on shipments of cash from England to stay solvent. Shipments which were being met with ever more resistance in England itself. This resulted in many English garrisons going on strike, or worse, turning on the local populace they were supposed to defend. The practice of levying pâtis, in essence protection money, became common throughout Normandy and the Pied de Conquête, as did raiding and brigandage, which did not inspire much loyalty to the English regime. As English rule in Normandy deteriorated, their hold on Guyenne suffered as well. The inheritance of Alienor of Aquitaine, which was at one point the focus of the 100 Years' War, was now a mostly ignored side theater. As the main action of the war moved north of the Loire, local truces between the English and the great magnates of the southwest, Albret, Armagnac, and Foix, protected Guyenne. But in the later 1430s, Charles II of Albret, son of the old Constable of France of the same name, decided that it was time to fully throw in his lot with the French. King Charles provided the Lord of Albret with an army of écocheurs, which had the bonus effect of getting the mercenaries out of the north, and before long, English Guyenne was in chaos. In 1442, Charles VII would take another army into Guyenne, and it looked like the duchy would not be able to hold out. But in the end, Guyenne was saved by the simple facts that war is expensive and logistics are difficult. Despite the recovery of French finances, the king had trouble paying for and feeding his army throughout the campaign, especially as he strayed further from his power base along the Loire. Guyenne survived, but only barely, as now it was contained to Bordeaux and its surrounding territory, and a chunk in the far south around the towns of Bayonne, Saint-Sever, and Dax. At this point, the English were desperate to get the French to return to the negotiating table, but their problem was that they had nothing to offer, and everything to lose. So in order to gain some leverage, John Beaufort, the Duke of Somerset, was sent into France with an army in order to do something. The couch cushions of the English state were reached into, and as much spare change as possible was wrangled up. John's uncle, Cardinal Henry Beaufort, paid for much of the expedition, but other loans would be needed to cover the rest, and the usual revenues and reinforcements earmarked for Normandy would be reassigned, much to the chagrin of Richard, Duke of York, the lieutenant of the duchy. I'm not going to go into the details of Somerset's campaign, but I will mention that it was such a disaster that upon his return to England, Somerset was shunned from court and died, likely by suicide, soon after. And now, if anything, the English had even less to bargain with. Still, though, Henry VI and his advisors knew that they could simply not keep going, and so when an invitation to yet another peace conference arrived in London, the English accepted with resignation. This conference was the project of the Dukes of Orléans and Brittany, which should not be all that surprising. Orléans was ransomed on the assumption that he would facilitate the peace process after all, and the Duchy of Brittany's position along the front made its dukes eager to put an end to the fighting. This Duke of Brittany was not John V, who died in 1442, but rather his son Francis. And wow, John V has been the Duke of Brittany for a while, since Philip the Bold's time. Despite his occasional disagreements with John the Fearless during the Civil War, John V was a fairly solid Burgundian ally throughout most of his reign, and he even became a member of the Order of the Golden Fleece in 1440. Brittany's location on the French periphery, its exposure to the English, and its tradition of independence put it in a very similar spot to Flanders, and John V often saw his interests aligned with Burgundian ones. Duke Francis, on the other hand, saw his interests as best served through alliance with France, and that would be made clear to Philip the Good when the new Breton duke rejected the offer of membership in the Golden Fleece a few years later. This change in perspective was motivated by a few things. On the personal side, Francis's mother was a sister of Charles VII, and his first wife was an Angevin princess. There was also the matter of his brother Gilles, who was a full-on believer in the English cause, and after he began causing trouble for Francis, the Duke moved closer to France in response. More on that next episode. Moreover, the links between the ducal families of Burgundy and Brittany were eroded by the death of Margaret of Burgundy, Philip the Good's sister, and Arthur de Richemont's wife in 1442. And of course, there's the simple fact that France was growing in power while England was on the decline. That all being said, I don't want to imply that Francis was an enemy of Burgundy or even England at this point, but he did see his interests as closer to French ones than his father did, and that change in perspective was not good for Philip. Anyways, Charles VII had made a lot of progress over the past decade, and in that time he had never really been too enthusiastic about negotiations with England. And to be fair, I wouldn't call him especially enthusiastic about the coming negotiations either. Still though, the situation in France was conducive to peace. Charles had retaken significant amounts of English territory, and the territory that remained tended to be the most pro-English and was strongly garrisoned. And you never know, there was always the chance that an English army could win another Crécy, or Poitiers, or Agincourt, or Verneuil. They had done it before. In short, the King of France liked his position, but knew not to overestimate the ease of finishing the job or underestimate his opponent. And on the other hand, Charles was in a position of strength here, and so even if he was not totally confident about his chances on the battlefield, he could more or less dictate terms at the negotiating table. The worst that the English could do was say no. This balance of power, or lack thereof, was well understood by the English, and I think really comes across in the Earl of Suffolk's demands to King Henry when he agreed to lead the English delegation. Included in these demands was a request for letters of pardon which absolved him from any charges of misconduct that might arise from the ensuing negotiations or treaty. This was not the request of a man who expected to return home with a good deal. The talks opened in early 1444, and the first major difference in these negotiations from previous ones, apart from the fact that Renaud de Chartres was no longer leading the French delegation on account of being dead, was the fact that the English delegation was finally willing to consider letting go of Henry's now fairly ridiculous claim to the Kingdom of France. However, a crown was worth a whole lot, even one with a claim as dubious as this, and the English delegation was hoping to gain some juicy territorial concessions in exchange. And oh, by the way, this territory would be held with full sovereignty, of course. But Charles was totally unwilling to cede French land with full sovereignty, and the English were totally unwilling to pay homage to Charles. So, yet again, the two sides found themselves at an impasse. The same impasse that had blocked peace deals for basically the entirety of the war. Which brings us to the second major difference between these negotiations and previous ones. In a reversal of his prior policy of peace above truce, Charles VII now seemed willing, eager even, to negotiate a truce rather than a permanent peace. So all the thorny issues were put to the side, and the French and English agreed to a truce of a little under 2 years. Both sides would keep the territory they currently held, and Charles's niece, Margaret of Anjou, would be married to King Henry to seal the truce. But why Charles's niece rather than one of his daughters? Obviously the fact that they would be first cousins had nothing to do with it, as these were nobles in the Middle Ages. No. Charles VII did not want the kings of England getting yet another claim to the French throne. He had learned well from the cases of Isabella of France and Catherine of Valois. The English agreed to the match, and further hoped that this tie to the Angevins would win them the favor of the king in future dealings, and maybe even settle the issue of Maine. but we'll dive more into that later. For now, let's look at how Charles VII made the most of the breathing room he got at Tours. After the truce was signed, one problem immediately became apparent. And it's a problem that we've been dealing with for a little while now. What to do about all the accoucheurs who were suddenly out of work. Last episode, we saw how King Charles and Dauphin Louis led expeditions into Lorraine and Alsace, but this was only a temporary solution. The mercenaries could not be distracted forever, and a more permanent fix was needed. The accoucheurs were not a new problem. They had menaced France and Burgundy for years now, and earlier pauses in the 100 Years' War had had their own problems with unemployed mercenaries. So there was some precedent for dealing with them. Distracting them with a foreign campaign, as we just mentioned, paying them off, fighting them, improving local defenses, getting them to fight each other, and more. All of these solutions had worked from time to time, but none were really equipped to deal with the scale of the problem facing the kingdom. So the king decided to try a novel approach. He would form a standing army, the first in France since the days of the Roman Empire. And while I'll be saying that the king did this or ordered that, the main mastermind behind these reforms was Arthur de Richemont, the Constable of France. And he was aided in this by John of Orleans, the Count of Dunois, as well as Charles's newest favorite, Pierre de Breze. The basic unit of this new army would be the lance, a fairly standard unit in late medieval warfare, which was composed of a knight, a more lightly equipped soldier known as a coutelier, and 2 archers supported by a page or 2. 100 lances would then be grouped into compagnies d'ordonnance, companies of ordnance, which is generally what this army would be known as. The professional force of former accoucheurs was augmented by the militia of the Francs Archers, free archers, so called because the archers and crossbowmen that made up this militia were exempted from most forms of taxation. The king's plan was to raise 20 compagnies d'ordonnance, so 2,000 lances or about 8,000 fighting men, to be paid for directly by the king. And while more than those 20 compagnies would be raised, few of them would be at full strength, and the king's army would initially be closer to 7,000 strong than 8. Still though, this was a major undertaking, and some back-of-the-napkin math indicates that the compagnies cost the crown roughly 650,000 francs a year, a sum on par with, if not higher, than the Duke of Burgundy's total revenues in this period. And over the course of the king's reign, the number of soldiers employed, and their cost, would grow still further. Therefore, figuring out how to pay for this army was the most challenging part of the project. Easing things somewhat was the fact that the compagnies d'ordonnance would be spread throughout the kingdom. This would make it so that a given region would only have to support 100 lances rather than, say, 1,000, reducing the burden on the locals, and reducing the amount of damage that a rogue captain could do. Consequently, a decentralized approach to pay and supply was taken, and it would be up to the local community which hosted a company to support it. Initially, these local communities would pay a small amount in coin and also supply the unit, but it soon became apparent that it was easier for everyone involved to move to a system of purely monetary taxation and have the units buy their supplies as needed. Over time, this system continued to evolve, and the costs of the compagnies were further spread around, while the organization of them was centralized. No longer were communities directly paying for the garrisons in their midst. Now they were paying taxes to the central government for the army as a whole, and it was up to the French Chambre des Comptes and other financial institutions to keep track of and distribute the funds. Now, this all begs the question, how effective was this reform in dealing with the problem of the accoucheurs? In short, very. About half of the accoucheur companies would be folded into the compagnies d'ordonnance, and the other half were to be disbanded. The accoucheurs deemed too unreliable to join the companies were given a pardon for any misdeeds they might have committed while under arms, along with the threat that any future misdeeds would be met with serious consequences. and as the Compagnies d'Ordonnance now gave the king the means to make good on that threat, for the most part the still unemployed mercenaries really did disperse. And moreover, those écocheurs who were folded into the royal army kept good discipline and did not return to raiding. This was in part due to the regular inspections from royal officers, which made sure that the companies were paid in full and on time, that they were well equipped, and that they were behaving themselves. And it was in part due to the fact that relatively few écocheur captains were kept on, and only the most reliable. For the most part, the captains of the compagnies were men known and trusted by the king and his government. But that was not all. Over time, an esprit de corps developed, and the army's loyalty to the crown, rather than to powerful magnates or their captains, was secured. We saw a few episodes back that Charles had attempted similar reforms in the 1430s, but had to abandon them due to backlash from the high nobles and great écocheur captains. But now, almost a decade later, the king had the strength to force the issue. The war was going well, and Tours was a truce on French terms. The financial organs of state were moving, and royal power was on the rise. The military reforms of the 1440s would only further strengthen the king, and they paved the way for the eventual reconquest of Normandy and Guyenne. The increasing power of the French crown was not really good news for the Duke of Burgundy, and as the king grew stronger and more confident, he also grew more openly antagonistic towards Burgundy, and more eager to rein in his most powerful vassal. So here we get another reason for the king and Dauphin's expeditions into Alsace and Lorraine. The Dauphin's expedition in particular was a fairly direct shot across the bow for Burgundy, as his march to Alsace took him straight through the Franche-Comté. And in fact, much of the Dauphin's activity in the past few years had involved some element of antagonism towards Burgundy. Before leading the écocheurs against the Swiss, and before the Truce of Tours, Louis had led the relief of the Norman town of Dieppe, and during that expedition he had allowed his men to regularly raid into Picardy. The Dauphin was then sent down to the south of France to deal with the rebellious Count of Armagnac, and as he returned north, one of his captains, Antoine de Chabannes, the Count of Dampmartin, decided to take the long way up through Burgundy. Thibaud de Neuchatel, the Marshal of Burgundy, was able to see Chabannes' force off, but significant damage was still done. When Chabannes returned to the Dauphin, Louis was said to have remarked, quote, "Well, Count of Dampmartin, I hear the Marshal of Burgundy has given you a trouncing." To which Chabannes replied, "True, my lord, but my band and I have done ourselves up again, for we've had 10,000 crowns from the Marshal's territory, and I have well warmed myself in his villages, and drunk good wine." And after the Dauphin returned from Alsace, he maintained a company of écocheurs in Montbayard, right on the edge of the county of Burgundy. These écocheurs would be a constant nuisance to the two Burgundies, and Thibaud de Neuchatel speculated that, quote, "The king and my lord the Dauphin had secretly ordered these troops to live off Burgundian territory until the Conference of Reims, and to act in such a way as to ensure that complaints were made about them." The Reims Conference, which the Marshal of Burgundy mentioned, was to take place in the spring of 1445. It was organized to provide the king and duke with an opportunity to address and put to bed all the issues which had popped up between them in the decade after Arras. In preparation for the conference, the Duke of Burgundy drew up a list of 32 grievances which included things such as Charles's failure to uphold parts of the Treaty of Arras, particularly the parts concerning restitution and justice for the murder of John the Fearless, the king's repeated infringements on Philip's ducal rights, debts owed to Burgundy, and the overreach of the Paris Parlement, all common complaints from the past decade, as well as some more recent gripes such as the Dauphin's outpost at Montbayard, and the fact that French soldiers were occupying a handful of places in the newly Burgundian Duchy of Luxembourg. Nothing was really settled at Reims, and so a few months later, Philip sent his wife, Isabella of Portugal, to meet with the king at Chalons. This would not be Isabella's first appearance at the French court, as she had spent some time there a few years earlier, also in an attempt to ease the relationship between France and Burgundy. The chronicler Enguerrand de Monstrelet wrote of the earlier visit, quote, "King Charles, having celebrated the festival of Easter at the bishop's palace at Laon, held several councils on the requests which the Duchess of Burgundy had made, at the conclusion of which few, if any, were granted. She was much displeased at this, and saw clearly, as well as those who had accompanied her, that the king's ministers were not well inclined towards the Duke of Burgundy or his concerns." So Isabella was not too optimistic about how the conference at Châlons would go, and she was right to think so. A deal actually would come out of Châlons, but it was not a great deal for Burgundy, and it addressed few of the Duke's issues. In exchange for releasing René of Anjou from his ransom, King Charles agreed to order the Dauphin's men out of Montbayard, and prevent a case against the 4 members of Flanders from being heard in the Paris Parlement. And even these minor concessions required the Duchess to bribe some of the king's courtiers. Richard Vaughan described this deal as more of a surrender than a concession from the Duke of Burgundy. The steady application of political, diplomatic, and military pressure had pushed Philip the Good to give up his ransom of René of Anjou, still worth over 80,000 écus. And in exchange the king made a half-hearted promise and moved a garrison. No true resolution to the differences between the king and the duke was reached, and most of Burgundy's 32 grievances were simply ignored. Before I move on, I do want to note that Alienor de Poitiers, the daughter of one of Isabella's ladies-in-waiting, wrote about this meeting, and her account gives us a nice picture of the battle for precedence between the Dukes of Burgundy and Anjou as played out between their wives. As René claimed to be the King of Sicily, that did technically give him precedence above a duke. But Philip was not just any duke, and René was not really the King of Sicily. Poitiers relates that while Isabella of Portugal knelt before the Queen of France and the Dauphiné, when she went to greet Isabella of Lorraine, the Duchess of Anjou and titular Queen of Sicily, quote, "This time she only performed a shallow curtsy. According to my mother, neither of them were likely to damage their kneecaps in curtsying to each other." She continues, quote, "Of the Duchess's ladies-in-waiting, the Queen kissed my Lady of Montague, my mother, and my Lady of Crèvecoeur, and no others. But she shook all the gentlewomen by the hand, and the Dauphiness did the same. Then the Duchess kissed all the Queen's and the Dauphiness's ladies, but only as many of the Queen of Sicily's ladies as the Queen of Sicily had embraced of hers. On no account would my Lady the Duchess allow herself to be preceded by the Queen of Sicily, for she maintained that my lord the Duke was more nearly related to the crown of France than the King of Sicily. Also, she was the daughter of a King of Portugal, who is much more important than the King of Sicily." But while this battle for precedence ended in a draw, the Angevins were in a far better position in the battle for influence at court. Although the family's influence was not quite what it once was, with Pierre de Breze taking Charles of Anjou's place as the king's favorite, and Agnes Sorel supplanting Queen Marie of Anjou in the king's affections, the Angevins were still tied into the court, while the Burgundians were still on the outs. The king remained hostile to Burgundy, and was determined to undermine the duke's independence. An example of this can be seen later that year, when a meeting of the Order of the Golden Fleece was interrupted by an usher of the Paris Parlement, who insolently summoned the Duke of Burgundy to the court. This insult was aggravated by the fact that Philip was technically exempted from its jurisdiction as per the Treaty of Arras. Burgundy and France would enter into negotiations again in 1448, and by then Philip's list of grievances had grown from 32 to 67. In this round of negotiations, more of the Duke's requests would be granted, but most were still ignored, and the ones that were granted were the least impactful, such as the king telling the royal bailiff of Seine to stop referring to himself as the bailiff of Auxerre, or recognizing Philip's use of Duke by the grace of God. The king did also make some more meaningful concessions, such as ordering his soldiers not to raid Burgundian territory and telling his officials not to try and exercise royal rights in the Duchy of Burgundy. But these concessions required a follow-through that the king was unwilling to commit to, and these issues were not put to bed in 1448. As Richard Vaughan put it, without the king's goodwill, these concessions were merely scraps of parchment. And that point about the king's goodwill feels especially salient because the English were dealing with a similar conundrum. As I mentioned earlier, the Truce of Tours was originally meant to last for just 22 months and provide room for more negotiations to occur. As those negotiations opened, the French delegation made a major demand, the county of Maine. But not only did the French demand Maine, they demanded Maine as a precondition to continue negotiations, and under these terms they would keep it, regardless of whether or not a peace was reached. Publicly, the Earl of Suffolk, the lead negotiator for the English, balked at this demand, but it is possible that he offered some private assurances that this would be done. The fact of the matter was that King Henry was desperate for peace, and believed, quite naively, that his uncle Charles's goodwill could be secured by the cession. So even if Suffolk disagreed with the decision to cede Maine to the English, the king was determined to make it happen. And towards the end of 1445, the king gave his formal assent. And oh boy, does the way which Henry did this betray his utter incompetence. The king did not demand any concessions or guarantees in exchange for the county, and instead wrote that he would cede Maine to secure the goodwill of Charles VII as well as his Angevin wife and in-laws, quote, "and because we hope that on this account the matter of the principal peace will proceed better and come to a more speedy and satisfactory conclusion." Likely knowing that simply giving a county away would be unpopular, Henry gave his assent in secret. But the secret would not stay hidden for long, as Charles VII and the Angevins were eager to reclaim Maine, and once they did it, it would be pretty out in the open. So, in effect, Henry was just punting the issue a little ways down the road. In the end, the transfer of Maine would have little goodwill involved. News leaked almost immediately. The rest of the English government was less than enthused that the king was going to give away the hard-won province, and Parliament, the general public, and the soldiers all put up a fight to keep Maine. The English settlers in Maine, and those rewarded for their military service with land in the county, received no promise of compensation, and refused to be displaced. They had powerful allies back in England, and before long, Maine had become the issue of the day. For his part, King Charles seems to have had little understanding of the political constraints of English kingship, and so was growing ever more frustrated with what he saw as Henry's duplicitous delays and excuses. Whatever goodwill had been generated by the promise to give up Maine was being drained by the resulting failure to adhere to the timeline. So over the next few years, you see Charles VII constantly badgering Henry VI to give up Maine, just like he promised he would, Henry VI saying, "I know, I'm trying," and basically the rest of England going, "Are ya nuts?" But I guess with hindsight, we know the answer to that question. As Henry prepared to give up Maine, again for nothing apart from goodwill, the opposition of his other uncle, Humphrey, Duke of Gloucester, would need to be dealt with. Humphrey had been on the political sidelines for a while now, but he was still immensely popular in London, and was the unofficial head of the opposition, as his implacable views towards peace with France were well known. So when Parliament opened in early 1447, notably in Bury St. Edmunds rather than London, Humphrey and several of his allies were arrested and charged with treason. 5 days later, the Duke of Gloucester was dead. Possibly from murder, but more likely from a stroke or heart attack triggered by the stress of his arrest. Now, I'm not the biggest fan of Gloucester, but I do have to admit that I'm saddened by his end. The fact of the matter was that he was up to nothing, and his imprisonment was the act of a government trying to curb opposition to an unpopular and, honestly, boneheaded policy. It was unjust. And even this did not do much to ease the transfer of Maine. Opposition in England was strong even without Gloucester leading the charge, and the English settlers in Maine were not willing to give up their lands, much less without any promise of compensation. By early 1448, Charles VII had had enough, and he ordered Pierre de Breze and the Count of Dunois into Maine with several compagnies d'ordonnance. And before long, they were preparing to besiege Le Mans, the leading city in the county. Faced with the threat of a siege from the French and no support from their king, the officers on the ground finally agreed to give in. Maine was handed over to the French for nothing more than a 2-year extension to the Truce of Tours. But maybe I shouldn't be quite so hard on Henry, because the fact of the matter was that the English could really not afford to resume the war. While the French had built up their strength during the Truce of Tours, the English had spent the truce floundering. Their government was deep in debt, and the truce provided some much-needed breathing room. But breathing is really all that the English accomplished. The defenses and garrisons of Normandy were allowed to languish, and much-needed reforms were not taken. While Charles was now able to demand taxes by royal decree, Henry had to beg Parliament for taxation that they were unwilling to grant. So, while the cession of Maine was a bad deal, it's not like the English could have really afforded to press the issue. However, the English would not even end up getting the full 2 years of truce, and barely more than a year after Maine was handed over, France and England were back at war. And next time, we're finally going to wrap up the 100 Years' War. Thank you so much to my patrons: Christine, Duchesse de Nemours, Elliot, Graaf van Gravenstein, Anthony, Comte de Chateauneuf-en-Auxois, Preston, Comte de Saint-Fargeau, Mark, Comte de Merceau, Diana, Graaf van Beersel, Mehmet, Comte Santerre, Chris, Comte de Semur, Rosa, Comte de Germol, Elliot, Comte de Bussy-le-Grand, Eric, Comte de Couche, David, Graaf van Barland, Jonathan, Comte de Bazoches, Olivier, Comte d'Ussert, John, Graaf van Helmond, Spencer, Graaf van Breda, Craig, Graaf van Hoensbroek, Lexi, Comte de Blancmont, Sam, Graaf van Mormond, and to my Knights of the Duchy. If you want to join them, you can at patreon.com/ValoisBurgundy. If you want to support the podcast in other ways, you can do so by leaving a review on your podcast app of choice and telling your friends about the show. Both really help to grow the show and will earn you my everlasting appreciation. If you want to keep up with the show, you can follow me at ValoisBurgundy on Blue Sky, and check out the podcast website for maps, images, sources, and more at granddukesofthewest.com. Once again, thank you for listening.